our last lecture of the day by Dr. Kate Liszka, who is the Benson and Pamela Hare Fellow in Egyptology and Associate Professor of History at Cal State San Bernardino, a neighboring institution of ours, as you all know. She received her PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in Egyptian archaeology, and then became a Kotzen Fellow in the Society of Fellows at Princeton University. In 2014, she started the Wadi el-Hudi expedition, which really incorporates some 40 different archaeological sites in the eastern desert of Egypt. Wadi el-Hudi is a geologically rich region where the pharaohs 4,000 years ago sent large expeditions to gather amethyst and gold for their royal jewelry. Her research also specializes on connections between Egypt and Nubia, especially Nubians living in Egypt and coming into contact with the Egyptian state. While in graduate school, she spent several years lecturing for the University of Pennsylvania Museums of Archaeology and Anthropology to people all around the East Coast, almost anything and everything Egypt related. King Tut, his family, and his archaeology was one of her most popular topics. So obviously we look forward to her presentation tonight called King Tut, the boy who changed the world twice when alive and 3,500 years later. So Dr. Liszka, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out here today, and I very much recognize that I am standing between you and your dinner. So with that being said, I will try to go quickly. But I am really thrilled to be here at La Sierra University. This is my first time, despite the fact that I'm just down the road in San Bernardino. Hopefully we'll do this much more often. And I just want to tell everybody here, if you haven't been to CSUSB, please, come visit. We have an amazing museum there called the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art. A lot of my students go and visit it frequently for their papers. We have a large collection of ancient Egyptian objects and also a very vibrant modern art collection that rotates a few times a year. So please come see the museum. And even right now, just down the road where we'll be having the next event, I believe, RAFMA, the Robert and Frances Fullerton Museum of Art, is doing a 3D model exhibit. They've turned their entire exhibition into a 3D model, and you can actually, just walking a few paces down that way, visit it virtually, and then driving 20 miles down the road, see it for real. So please come do this. I'd love to see you guys all there. Okay, King Tut. So let me see how this works. Okay, so thank you all for coming out to view on King Tut today. I just want to say before we begin, happy anniversary, yay! For those of you guys who don't know, King Tut's tomb was found 100 years ago. Almost exactly. The stairs were found on November 4th, 1922, and they opened the tomb on November 23rd, 1922. So we are currently 100 years ago when Lord Carnarvon was like in the boat from England racing down to Luxor to see what Howard Carter had found. So this is very well timed. I also want to say happy death date to King Tut. He probably died in either December or January. We're not quite sure exactly when he was about 18, but we know it was in December or January because of the flowering plants in his tomb. They were the ones in bloom in winter. So really, this is a wonderful time. Well, not for Tut, he died, but still. Anyway, moving right along. We can't talk about King Tut without talking about his father, Akhenaten, who I am so thrilled that, Dr. Hoffmeyer just gave you an overview of him and his world. He's really amazing, and everything that Tutankhamun did in reaction was almost always in reaction to his dad, in the world that his dad created. Now, to understand Akhenaten, you also have to understand Amenhotep III, right? Akhenaten's father, King Tut's possible grandfather, we'll just call it that. When Amenhotep III was king, the world was wealthy. The world was peaceful. Egypt had a colony. When Amenhotep III was in fact in charge of the world, right? They had managed to take over parts of the Levant. They had taken over all of Egypt. Tutmosis III had started this massive colonial empire and money was coming in. Tutmosis IV had set out world peace everywhere. And Amenhotep III sat around in a peaceful, happy, wealthy world without any giant real problems. I mean, there were problems, but still, comparatively, like this is a very wealthy, peaceful time. This is the kingdom that Akhenaten inherited and then destroyed. And he did this very much, not necessarily because he meant to, but because of this shift to Atenism, because of this shift to his God. And Dr. Hoffmeyer talked about why, and I will always follow his footsteps as to why, when, and how, but there were a lot of big implications for what he did. This is not necessarily what, everybody in the world had wanted to see. And of course, there was a lot of pushback. So when he starts making all of these changes, right, a lot of the administrators were like, you can't just throw out our entire polytheistic religion. And so what did he do? Well, he replaced them with yes men. Those people were just sent on their way, and people who were going to follow him were put into place. In addition to that, Akhenaten actually changes a lot of what is going on with Amun too, right? He decides to shut down the temples of Amun throughout, especially in Thebes, but in other places too. And with all the other, 1,997 gods, basically, he just ignores their temples. And by doing this, this sets the world into economic collapse. If you close down a temple or you don't give it its funds, it means that the entire economy just kind of shrivels up because the money's not there at that point. And so that causes a lot of problems. In addition to this, he was so vehemently against Amun that he used the Egyptian army essentially to travel throughout the country and hack out every single instance of Amun's name and many of Amun's faces, which means that the army isn't doing what it should be doing. No, it's going on an iconoclasm mission at that point, which he thought was important, but has larger world implications to it. Now, in addition to this, there is a major international crisis that's about to happen too. Now, when Amenhotep III was king, the Mitanni were in power, the Hatti or the Hittites were mostly in power further north. There was mostly peace. But during Akhenaten's reign, the Hittites decided basically to take over the Mitanni. And at that time, they're all writing to Akhenaten saying, help me, get involved, be a mediator. And what does he do? No, thanks, I'm hanging out at Amarna. And it's just like all of these international real world things are not being attended to because he is following his religion. In addition to that, Egypt's empire starts to collapse and fall in the Levant. All of the space that was taken over realizes that Akhenaten's not paying attention anymore. The army's out on an iconoclasm mission, so this is a good time to walk away. And a lot of these middle areas end up going to the north. They end up becoming part of the Mitanni or the Hittites or doing their own thing, and the Egyptian empire starts to shrink because Akhenaten's not paying attention. Or he doesn't care. I'm not sure, but this is a real world implication to what is actually happening at this time. Now, something that is not Akhenaten's fault, at the same time, an international plague starts. Now, he didn't cause that, but this is something he has to deal with. People start dying and dying young because of this plague. But Akhenaten decides to essentially, why did it go back to here? Can we go to the slide of Amarna? think it's about 10 in. At this point, Akhenaten basically decides to start and find a new city. So at this point, in year 5, Akhenaten decides to find his new city of Amarna, and he moves in year 6. This is not a small feat. There are, almost a dozen temples and palaces. There are tombs. This is a massive amount of things. It ended up housing 20,000 people. And in building this city and building it so quickly, it meant that he had to bring in massive amounts of craftsmen and labor forces to be able to get this done, in addition to changing the building methods to the teletat blocks that Dr. Hoffmeyer talked about, the small ones that are easy to be carried. And so to move in that quickly, he essentially lays out a very, very brief blueprint, enough to get up and running, and he moves in around year 6. And then for the remainder of his reign, up until year 17, they're basically building the city. They're building and changing things around them, making these temporary structures more permanent. So 20,000 people to move to Amarna. Of course, you have your government, you have your administrators, you have your yes men, but you also have the majority of people who are tasked with building the entire place. Now, at the same time, this is the area that King Tut was born in, right? He came to the throne around year 9, so he's born probably when Akhenaten is, who knows, in year 13, 14, 15, depending on how you count. He didn't know the world before this. This is where he came from. Now, at the same time, when Akhenaten was actually building the city, he was building it so quickly, he didn't take care of the people who built it either. And this has just come to fruition with a number of a new cemetery that Barry Kemp has been excavating of the workers who built Amarna. A lot of the people are young. A lot of the people suffered from very torturous types of breaks. A lot of them didn't have the proper amounts of protein. This was very, very hard labor. And compared to what Kent was talking about in the first lecture, right? The people who built the pyramids were better treated. They had protein. They had houses that were pretty good. Yes, of course, there were problems. Yes, of course, people got hurt, but it isn't the same level. So whatever Akhenaten's doing, he is not being nice to the people who are actually building his city. But it was done for his religion, for his government, for everything, for his new vision. So you can imagine when King Tut, when Akhenaten dies, right? The world is basically at odds with everything he's been doing for the last 17 years, not because of the Aten. The Aten was one of their gods for thousands of years, but because what he did in the name of the Aten, or what he did to them. I mean, obviously the religion side is great. He's believing his God, he's believing in his religion, but there are real world implications to all this. Anyway, so Akhenaten dies, year 17, that may or may not be him, giant debate I'm skipping. Nefertiti might have come to the throne for up to 3 years. Another giant debate we could talk about for 3 hours, most of which I'm skipping. I think 60% of Egyptologists now agree that she was probably king. Not everybody, we're not gonna get into it, but it is fascinating. So maybe Nefertiti came to the throne for 3 years, I don't know. But then one of the things that we see at this point is that somebody, whoever follows Akhenaten, starts to try to make amends to what Akhenaten had done. And this is just a small thing. We have a tiny graffiti in Thebes that is basically about opening Amun again, or the temples of Amun again. It's called the Mansion of Akhenaten in Thebes. And there's a hymn to Amun, kind of showing that these types of things are allowed again, maybe mentioning that the temple of Amun has been opened, but not really. And this is a half measure. This is not cleaning up after Akhenaten and returning to their polytheistic religion at this point. So King Tut comes to the throne because Nefertiti or whoever else was king for 3 years then died. And he comes to the throne at the ripe old age of 9. And he inherits this. right? He doesn't inherit what Akhenaten inherited. He inherits this kingdom where he grew up in glamour and glory and all of these palaces. But at the same time, everybody around him is now breaking with this pushback against everything. He doesn't know the world prior to his dad. Now, at the same time, do you let a 9-year-old run the government? No. No, you don't. And the Egyptians have known this for, 1,500 years at this point. There have been several instances where a king comes to the throne and he's too young. And in most of those cases, the child's biological mother takes over, runs the government for him. And then when he becomes, the ripe old age of old enough, 16, 17, who really knows, she gives the government to him. And then steps aside nicely. But King Tut's biological mother must have been dead. There's a plague on, there's a lot of other things happening, so that's not really an option when he comes to the throne. He's the end of a lineage at this time. So instead, we have two other officials, a guy by the name of Ai, then a guy by the name of Horemheb, both of whom, by the way, become the next two kings, Ai and then Horemheb. And they were likely helping him run the government. So there is always a question as to how many of these thoughts, how many of these actions belong to King Tut, and how many of them were the adults in the room, literally, not figuratively, right? How many of them were the adults manipulating him? Although I tend to think that King Tut actually was in on this, that he did agree with parts of it for reasons that I will show you. So one of the things that happens is almost immediately after King Tut comes to the throne, maybe year 1, maybe year 4, depending on who you follow, but early, they decide to change everything back to the way that it had been before King Tut became king, before Akhenaten had became king. They decide to revert everything. This is a massive change, right? So they resend the political capital to Memphis again. They send the religious capital back to Thebes. They shut down Amarna and they empty it out, essentially. They move all the craftsmen back, they give them jobs elsewhere, and they basically decide to restore traditional Egyptian religion. And they mark this occasion with the restoration stele that is from Karnak. And it was originally written in the name of Tutankhamun. It's much longer than what I have on the screen, but essentially what happens is it describes the world as being chaotic and the gods having turned their backs on the land. And that was because Akhenaten was focused on the Aten and ignoring them, not giving money to their temples, not letting them being celebrated, their monuments falling into ruin, right? But then the king decided to restore everything. He starts rebuilding things. He reopens the temples. He reopens the stream of money going into the temples at this point. It goes on and on and on. I skipped many paragraphs in this. But after he did this, the gods are happy and they come back to Egypt. And so this is great. You actually see this restoration. And this is a pivotal event that is not just a half measure like you saw in the graffiti, right? This is a full on, we are changing back to the way we were before. We are rejecting what Akhenaten did in the name of the Aten, not the Aten itself. And to mark this, Tutankhamun changed his name. When he was born with the name Tutankhaten, right? His dad's god, Tutankhaten. It means the living image of the Aten. And he changed his name to Tutankhamun, the god his dad hated the most. He's not Tutankhath. He's not Tutankhathor, Tutankosiris, anybody? No, he's Tutankhamun. Similarly, his wife, Ankhesenpa'aten, see that? She's also a daughter of Akhenaten. She becomes Ankhesenamun, putting the Amun right in that. And I tend to think that they had a say. If they were really for what their dad had done, that they would have picked a different god. Adults can manipulate them so much, but in this case, they picked that one. And in addition to that, he has a whole series of statuary created that are basically Tutankhamun in the guise of Amun, where basically is King Tut looking like the god, right? But what does his name mean? His name literally means the living image of Amun. So if you make a bunch of statues that look like King Tut, where he walks around as the living image of Amun, he's effectively enacting his name. And you can see that both in temples and in his tomb too. Not to mention the fact that in his tomb, we see all of the, well, not all of them, but many, many of the traditional polytheistic gods of Egypt from before the times, right? And they all come back, in addition to many other things. So this is a total and complete restoration of the religion at this time. And then he dies. He dies at like the age of 18. This is unexpected. His tomb was not ready at all. And so when this happened, it took everybody by surprise, and they had to like figure it out. And I have another hour-long lecture on that I'll just skip. Anyway, so he's buried, right? And at that point, and then Horemheb, 3 years later, becomes king. And Horemheb especially decides to usurp absolutely everything that Tut had done in the name of restoration. He usurps his statues. You can see he changed the name on the belt, right? It doesn't say King Tut anymore. No, it says Horemheb. In addition, that entire restoration stele now says Horemheb. And everything that Tut had done to restore, he takes credit for. And then he's king for another 28 years. So he actually has the time to really set this in and kind of like push Tut's achievements out of the way. But this was, in fact, Tut's achievement. But at the same time, it is so important to history, this reversion, that Horemheb needs to take credit for it. And Horemheb continues dismantling all of Amarna. You can actually see that they take down things like the small Aten temple brick by brick. They remove things like the temples that Dr. Hoffmeyer was talking about and hide them inside of the pylons at Karnak Temple as the world's greatest recyclers, but also to take Akhenaten out of view now. So this was a big deal. It took Tut, Horemheb, Seti I, and even Ramses II a little bit, a good 70 years to clean up the 17-year mess of Akhenaten. It was important. Now, the thing that King Tut did, I mean, when King Tut died, he was buried in his beautiful tomb. And within 100 years of this burial, it had been robbed like 2 or 3 times. Not that many, but people had snuck in, stolen a couple things. The people had found it. The administrators found it, reclosed the tomb, re-hid the tomb. But in some ways, Horemheb was so powerful at trying to say, this isn't Tut, I did it, that people in many ways even forgot where King Tut was buried. So this is Tut's tomb down here, this lower one, right? This tomb right here is Ramses VI. 200 years later, by the time we get to Ramses VI's reign, he likely had forgotten where King Tut was buried to put his tomb so close. And when they hewn out his tomb, basically all of the workmen and the stonemasons just threw their stone on top of King Tut's entranceway, thus actually hiding it, genuinely hiding it until 1922. Where he's now preserved, unlike everybody else in the Valley of the Kings that has been robbed hundreds and hundreds of times. So King Tut, when he was alive, did change the world. And then when he died, he also changed the world. As I mentioned before, Howard Carter, who you see here, found his tomb in November 1922. This is Lord Carnarvon, the man who financed all of it as well. And it was truly a genuine, spectacular find. But at the same time, this find also changed the world, and changed the world a second time. So when Howard Carter found the tomb, basically what happened at this time is that it did change the world. You would see a number of objects in his tomb about daily life at this point. There are three primary ways that the finding of his tomb actually changed the world. So for Egyptologists, for historians, for people who care about the world in ancient Egypt, we learn so much from the objects in his tomb because they are preserved there and gone many, many other places. Simple things like cosmetics or mirrors or tweezers or lamps. Also things like King Tut's underwear, right? Like we have his underwear from the tomb and we actually like learn how people lived, and a lot of what we can expand onto the rest of ancient Egyptian society has hints from his tomb. Now, of course, this is an incredibly elite context, so you have to take that into account, but we can still see what they're doing. Similarly, we also have a lot of information about weapons. He has a whole chariot fleet in there. And it is really cool because you can see the actual chariots, some of which might have actually been used in battle because they are these very thin wooden materials and edging, but you can see the technology in things like the wheels, right? Wheels are really hard to make in the ancient world because you have to get the axis or the axle right and the balance right, and they actually learned how to like wicker in different parts of the wood so it's lightweight and it has the right thing, the right axis in it. Okay, so most importantly, that's King Tut's underwear. There you go. Okay, moving on. But you also have things like bows and arrows. There's a chariot that could have been actually used. You have things like trumpets that are used for warfare to keep people together. You have a whole series of shields. We can learn so much about how things actually happened in the past by looking at this particular place. Not to mention the fact that you also have this great insight into how ancient Egyptian religion worked. Not just because we have the objects, which we've had in a lot of places, or the pictures or the discussions, but because you can see their practice in place. I mean, like, why are the oars laid out like that, right? Why do you have all of these stacked types of shrines inside of shrines, inside of shrines, inside of sarcophagi, smaller and smaller, like the Russian nesting doll? Apparently King Tut invented that too. But all of this relates to religious practice. And because we can see these objects in their original locations, it gives us this incredible insight. We also find out about the history of the past too. I mean, this is where we know that I was actually his inheritor because he became the next king of Egypt because he's performing the ceremony on King Tut. We know King Tut changed his name because of this golden throne that was found on his tomb with his original name, Tutankhamun, on it. We guess that Nefertiti was king before him and was disgraced because his funerary equipment had been used by somebody prior who was a king and likely female. And there, insert 2 hours of discussion right here that I'm skipping. We know that King Tut also had kids. He died at the age of 18, but he had 2 daughters. One died as an infant, was mummified and buried with him. The other one was miscarried, probably in like the late 2nd, early 3rd trimester. And yet they still gave enough respect to the miscarried child to mummify it and put it in his tomb also. This is kind of unheard of when it comes to the treatment of infants in the ancient world, but it is really touching. And you have this insight into the past that you don't have elsewhere. But King Tut's tomb changed the greater world too, changed the Western world, changed all of the news for a decade, right? It took Howard Carter 10 years to actually excavate the tomb of King Tut. And it was big news coming out in the 1920s. It really grabbed every single headline, started a whole fraction called Tut mania. And that, of course, was helped with a lovely conspiracy theory. You know how conspiracy theories love headlines, right? Well, there was the supposed curse of Tutankhamun, which of course didn't exist, but every paper repeated it anyway. And it was really fascinating because it starts to change a lot of modern culture at that time. I mean, Cecil D. DeMille basically made the he made the 10 Commandments, right? 1923, a year after King Tut was done. We have Robert Graves writing entire poems and books that end up talking about British social history and mentioning King Tut's tomb, an entire dress style change. Howard Carter went to the White House to visit Calvin Coolidge, right? The Life magazine changes. Oh, and by the way, H.P. Lovecraft writes a book called Under the Pyramids, which because of King Tut. And then that inspires Harry Houdini to do a whole series of escapes from pyramids, all because of Tut, right? This is a big deal. And then of course, it changed the entire Art Deco movement. You know, insert all of architectural history here. We have the Chrysler Building. We have the Electric Building in New York. We have the Empire State Building. We have all of the World's Fairs that you can see grabbing onto this Tut mania, expanding on Egyptomania and really focusing it on him. But that's not the only place that King Tut's tomb changed the world either. King Tut's tomb also changed the world in Egypt. I mean, what did the modern Egyptians, the contemporary Egyptians, think of the finding of his tomb, right? Okay, so before King Tut's tomb was found, at this point, Egypt was a veiled British protectorate. You guys, yeah. It had its own parliament, but you know, lots of British advisors hanging around telling them what to do. Similarly, basically the French were in charge of a lot of the monuments, a lot of the antiquities in particular. The legal rules of artifacts for Egypt were that prior to King Tut's tomb, there was a 50-50 split, essentially. When somebody found something cool, the excavator, the people who excavated it could take 50% home with them and 50% would stay in Egypt. I mean, you know, give or take. Objects could go to individuals. But at the same time, there was a massive decolonization push in Egypt by people like Saad Zahul and others. And Howard Carter had been looking for King Tut's tomb for 5 years. 5 years. He started in 1917. Another cool talk, but he finds it in 1922. And happenstance, 3 weeks before he found King Tut's tomb, in October 1922, they changed the rules of antiquity separation. So what happened now, 1 month before the finding of King Tut's tomb, is that all of the objects belong to Egypt first, but then they happily gift 50% to the people who are excavating, right? And similarly, no more artifacts are allowed to go to individuals. They all have to go to institutions. So Lord Carnarvon, the money behind this, right? The guy who owned Highclere Castle where Downton Abbey was filmed, is now like, excuse me? Some of that stuff has to go to my place. And it was legally not allowed, but these rules were changed 3 weeks before they found it. So it's kind of strange. Also, there was a subline saying any intact tomb had to fully belong in Egypt. It couldn't go anywhere else. So King Tut's tomb is found, and they're like, this is a big deal. And a lot of the Egyptian government and a lot of people in Egypt start rallying around it, around the decolonialism push. You know, we can't just let this stuff be taken out of our country. I mean, Howard Carter even writes to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he's like, don't worry, you guys will be taken care of. You'll get a lot of this stuff. And similarly, when there's a major pushback, when the Egyptian government starts saying, no, 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 you can't take this, it's an intact tomb, and Howard Carter's like, actually, it was robbed twice. Notice that? Notice, see? One object's gone, not intact, I can take it. It sets off this massive, massive push in the government that the country is paying attention to, that they're rallying around as a decolonialism push. Howard Carter actually sues the Egyptian government to try to take half of the objects, like he had thought he could up until 3 weeks before, during the first 4 years he excavated. It failed. Howard Carter decides to, at some point, have a short strike. I mean, he excavates the tomb for 10 years. That also fails. But Howard Carter does his job. He excavates for a full 10 years, and all of the artifacts stay in Egypt because of this push, because of this rallying cry around the find of King Tut. And then after the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, throwing off the British and becoming their own, this is only 25 years later, right? This is one of those things that people are still remembering. And it actively is one of those pieces in the conversation that changes the rules of antiquities in Egypt. Whereas starting in the late 1950s and early 1960s, no artifact found in Egypt, not even a broken pottery sherd, is allowed to leave the country at that point. And so it is the center of a major change in modern Egypt as well. So I would argue that King Tut might be one of the most important pharaohs in Egyptian history, despite the fact that he only came to the throne as a kid. And he died at the age of 18. He changed the world in the past, and he changed the world in the present. Thank you.
What a terrific lecture. One question, and then we've got to go, and you've got to catch her over at the reception where you can ask more questions. Is there one urgent question? Is there? Okay, there is in the back. Sorry, can't even see.
Awesome lecture, thank you so much. I just had a question. In King Tut's tomb, I remember seeing a bunch of monkeys on the wall, and I just wondered if there was any symbolism or significance to the monkeys on the wall of his tomb.
That's a scene from the Book of the Dead, standard scene from the Book of the Dead. It's interesting that it's the Book of the Dead because the Book of the Dead is not usually used for kings and usually used for people who are not kings. And it's one of the arguments that that tomb was originally first created for Ai, who is not royal. And then when he died so quickly, they basically gave him Ai's tomb. But standard Book of the Dead.
You want to answer that question? How will they get to hear other cool talks by you?
I teach classes just down the road in Cal State San Bernardino. I actually offer a class on New Kingdom history where we spend maybe 3 to 4 weeks talking about Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, and we do 2 weeks of just debate days between various authors and how like at the beginning of King, it's really fun. Anyway, California State University has an open university program where you can actually take a class if you want. So you could be a member of my class and you don't have to like get a BA at the same time. I also, I lecture anytime people ask me to. I tend to talk a lot.
You can tell she's a terrific teacher. Thank you so much for being here. Yeah.